and he's probably spent more time thinking about it. For the rest of us, it's more a question of, okay, we have to shift the way we support.
In the gilded halls of royalty, secrets rarely stay buried. When King Charles confessed, "I never stopped loving Diana," the palace erupted. Camilla, fighting to secure her place as queen, was reportedly furious, her composure shattered by a truth that cut deeper than any royal scandal. Tonight, we reveal the confession that could shake the monarchy to its core, the confession that shook the palace. It started as a whisper, the kind that slips through palace corridors like smoke. King Charles had allegedly spoken 5 devastating words. "I never stopped loving Diana." Within the marble walls of Windsor, where every conversation is calculated and every emotion buried beneath protocol, this confession hit like a royal earthquake. Palace insiders claim the admission came during a private moment, when Charles believed only Camilla could hear. But in the royal household, privacy is an illusion. The king's words reportedly escaped during an evening of reflection, after a particularly demanding day of state duties. Charles, momentarily stripped of his carefully constructed public facade, let slip the truth that has shadowed his marriage for decades. For Camilla, the confession was nothing short of devastating. Here was a woman who had endured 20 years of public scrutiny, who had fought tooth and nail for acceptance, who had finally achieved the ultimate prize, becoming queen consort. Yet in 5 words, her husband had revealed that his heart remained elsewhere. Sources close to the royal couple describe Camilla's reaction as explosive. The usually composed queen consort reportedly unleashed decades of suppressed resentment. Staff members witnessed something unprecedented. Camilla's legendary self-control completely shattered. The atmosphere within the palace became glacial overnight. Royal aides described walking on eggshells as the couple maintained their public appearances while their private world crumbled. Camilla's fury was palpable, her smile during public engagements noticeably strained. Behind closed doors, the argument allegedly raged for hours. Camilla had sacrificed everything for this marriage: her reputation, her peace, her dignity. To discover that Charles still carried a torch for Diana felt like the ultimate betrayal. The timing couldn't have been worse. As king and queen consort, Charles and Camilla needed to present a united front to the nation. Instead, their marriage was fracturing under the weight of an impossible truth: that some loves never die, no matter how inconvenient they become. Diana's ghost has haunted this relationship from the beginning. Every public appearance invites comparisons. Every anniversary of her death reminds the world what they lost. Every photograph of William and Harry serves as a living memorial to the peoples. Princess Charles's alleged admission wasn't just personal, it was political dynamite. How can a king rule effectively when his personal life is in chaos? How can Camilla command respect as queen when her husband's heart belongs to a dead woman? The palace machine quickly went into overdrive, smoothing over any visible cracks in the royal facade. Public engagements continued, smiles were manufactured, protocol was maintained. But insiders say the damage was done. In the days following the confession, observers noted subtle changes. The easy chemistry between Charles and Camilla seemed forced. Their body language grew distant. The warmth that had characterized their later years together appeared to have evaporated overnight. This wasn't just a marital spat. It was an existential crisis for the monarchy. Charles's reign was supposed to mark a new chapter, with Camilla finally accepted as his partner. Instead, the old wounds had reopened, bleeding all over their carefully constructed new beginning. The confession revealed what many had long suspected but none dared voice: that Charles's greatest love story wasn't with the woman who became his queen, but with the one who died in a Paris tunnel 27 years ago. As the sun rose on a new day, the palace returned to its choreographed routine. But beneath the surface, the foundations had shifted. Some truths, once spoken, can never be taken back. And some ghosts refuse to stay buried, no matter how many crowns you wear to forget them. A marriage built on secrets. Charles's confession didn't come from nowhere. It was the breaking point of a relationship that had always walked a tightrope, between love and obligation, between public duty and private desire. To understand Camilla's explosive reaction, you have to understand her journey. For over 2 decades, she lived as the other woman, whispered about in corners, vilified in headlines, forever cast as the homewrecker who destroyed a fairy tale marriage. When Diana famously declared there were 3 of us in her marriage, she didn't just expose an affair. She branded Camilla as the eternal outsider, the woman who could never measure up to the people's princess. Their 2005 wedding was supposed to change everything. After years of scandal and shame, Charles and Camilla could finally step into the light. But even then, the ceremony felt like an apology. Small, quiet, almost secretive. Nothing like the spectacle that had launched Charles and Diana's doomed union. The public never fully embraced her. Polls consistently showed Diana's enduring popularity, while Camilla remained tolerated rather than loved. She carried this burden with dignity, but the weight never lifted. Behind palace walls, the strain showed. Charles would fall into melancholic moods, his mind drifting to memories of his first wife. During these moments, Camilla would grow visibly tense, recognizing the signs of a man haunted by what he'd lost. Every photo of William and Harry reminded the world of their mother. Every anniversary of Diana's death brought fresh tributes to her memory. Camilla could never escape the comparisons, could never fully step out of Diana's shadow. Their marriage worked on many levels: shared humor, deep understanding, mutual respect forged through decades of adversity. But it was built on an unspoken agreement. They would never fully address the elephant in the room. Charles's confession shattered that careful balance. In 5 words, he confirmed Camilla's deepest fear, that she had spent her entire adult life competing with a ghost and losing. She had endured public humiliation, tabloid mockery, and years of being treated as a pariah. She had waited patiently for her moment, believing that becoming queen consort would finally validate her sacrifice. Instead, Charles's admission revealed the hollow victory she had achieved. She wore the crown, but she had never truly won his heart. That still belonged to a woman who died in a Paris tunnel 27 years ago. The confession exposed the fundamental tragedy of their relationship. Camilla had given everything to a man who could never fully give himself in return. She was queen consort in name, but forever the runner-up in the only competition that mattered. The night of the revelation. Clarence's house was quiet that evening. The staff had retreated. The cameras were gone. For once, King Charles and Queen Camilla had the privacy that royal life rarely affords. It should have been peaceful. Instead, it became the night that changed everything. Charles sat slumped in his favorite chair, exhaustion written across his face. Another grueling day of state duties had taken its toll. Camilla, ever supportive, handed him a whiskey and settled beside him. These were their sacred moments, when the royal masks could finally come off. That's when Charles made his fatal mistake. The conversation started innocently enough. Perhaps it was talk of their upcoming schedule, or a mention of William and Harry. Maybe it was simply the weight of memory pressing down on him after decades of carrying Diana's ghost. Whatever triggered it, Charles spoke without thinking. "I never stopped loving her." The words hung in the air like poison gas. Camilla's blood turned to ice. She had spent 27 years bracing for this moment. The moment her husband would finally admit what she'd always feared was true. The crystal glass slipped from her fingers, shattering against the marble floor. "What did you just say?" Her voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the force of decades of suppressed rage. Charles realized his mistake immediately. He tried to backtrack, to explain, to somehow soften the blow. But there was no taking those words back. "Camilla, I didn't mean what?" she exploded. "Didn't mean to tell me that our entire marriage is a lie? That I've been competing with a dead woman for 20 years? The argument that followed wasn't a screaming match. It was something far more devastating. Cold, calculated fury meeting desperate damage control. Camilla's voice remained steady, but her words cut like surgical knives. She had waited decades for her moment. She had endured public humiliation, tabloid mockery, and endless comparisons to the people's princess. And for what? To discover that her husband's heart had never truly belonged to her? "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" she hissed. "I gave up everything for you. My reputation, my peace, my dignity. and you sit there and tell me it was all for nothing." Charles tried desperately to explain. Diana was the mother of his sons. Their history couldn't be erased. Love wasn't finite, he could love them both. But every word he spoke only made it worse. Camilla wasn't interested in philosophical discussions about the nature of love. She was interested in one simple truth. After everything they'd been through, she still came second to a woman who had been dead for nearly 3 decades. The silence between his explanations grew longer and more dangerous. When Camilla finally spoke again, her words were measured and final. "I'm done pretending this doesn't matter," she said, rising from her chair. "I'm done pretending that being your consolation prize is enough." She walked toward the door, then stopped and turned back. "Congratulations, Charles. You've finally told me the truth. I hope it was worth it." The door closed behind her with a soft click that somehow felt louder than any slam. Charles sat alone, in the devastated quiet of their private sanctuary, finally understanding the true cost of his honesty. Some confessions once made can never be forgiven. The palace would wake to another day of smiles and ceremonies. But behind the facade, something fundamental had broken that night, and both of them knew it could never be repaired. Diana's shadow over the crown. When Eleanor closed her chamber door that night, leaving King Alexander alone with the echo of his own words, she was not only retreating from her husband, but from a truth that had haunted their union from the beginning. Isabella was gone, yet her presence remained alive in ways neither of them could escape. It was not simply that she had been beloved by the nation, nor that her untimely death had elevated her to near mythical status. It was the fact that Isabella had become immortal in memory, a figure whose radiance refused to fade even as the kingdom sought to move forward. For Eleanor, Isabella's shadow was not an occasional reminder. It was a constant presence, stretching across every step she took as queen consort. Alexander had always carried that shadow with him, even if he never intended to. Portraits of Isabella graced the halls of history, her gentle smile preserved in every chronicle, her compassion retold in countless tales of those whose lives she had touched. The people had chosen Isabella as their eternal Queen of Hearts, a symbol of grace and humanity that stood in sharp contrast to the crown's ancient protocols. No matter how many years passed, Alexander could not speak of her without awakening the same public devotion that had once eclipsed his own recognition. His confession to Eleanor, spoken in a moment of weary honesty, had not created the problem. It had only revealed the truth that had always lingered beneath the surface. For Eleanor, the anguish lay in knowing she had fought relentlessly to reshape that narrative. She had played the patient game, enduring harsh judgment, surviving the scrutiny of courtiers and chroniclers, and carefully building a more sympathetic image over time. She had become gradually, not merely accepted but even admired by some who had once opposed her. Yet the love the people still harbored for Isabella remained untouchable, and each anniversary of her passing rekindled that devotion. The sight of subjects leaving flowers at the palace gates, the ballads still sung in her honor, the tapestries depicting her alongside the young princes, these were constant reminders that Eleanor could never truly triumph over a woman who no longer walked among them but still commanded unwavering loyalty. Alexander himself seemed divided by this reality. His duties as king required him to project authority and composure, but his private moments revealed a man still marked by the loss of the woman who had shared his most formative years. His confession was not meant to wound Eleanor. In his mind, his love for Isabella did not diminish his devotion to his wife. He believed the two truths could exist in harmony. But Eleanor understood what he could not. The world would never permit such coexistence without conflict, for Isabella's memory was not a private matter. It was a force of nature, invoked by storytellers, cherished by the people, and woven permanently into the very fabric of the realm's history. The palace corridors were quiet the following dawn, yet within those walls the weight of Isabella's presence felt heavier than ever. Eleanor's anguish was not solely about Alexander's words, but about what they represented. No matter how high she ascended, no matter how firmly she wore the crown, Isabella's shadow stretched above them both, reminding the kingdom and the king himself that some legacies transcend the grave. Camilla's rage behind closed doors. The night of King Alexander's confession had ended in silence, but silence was never the true measure of Queen Eleanor's fury. In the hours that followed, as the palace carried on its morning rituals with quiet efficiency, those closest to her noticed the change immediately. Her movements were sharper, her words clipped, her eyes burning with a storm she struggled to contain. Eleanor had always been masterful at concealing her emotions in public, presenting unwavering composure even when her reputation was savaged by the court chroniclers. But behind closed doors, her restraint fractured, and the woman who had endured decades of comparison to the beloved Isabella could no longer suppress the rage that Alexander's words had unleashed. It began with a confrontation in their private chambers. Alexander, still subdued from the night before, attempted to carry on as if routine could mend what had been broken. He spoke softly, offered justifications, tried to make her understand that his words had been born from honest reflection, rather than deliberate cruelty. Yet the more he spoke, the more Eleanor's anger blazed. She accused him of dishonoring their union, of undermining the years she had fought to earn her place beside him. To her, it was not a momentary lapse, but a revelation that exposed the truth she had always dreaded, that no matter how secure her crown, she would always be second in his heart. Eleanor's fury was not wild or uncontrolled. She did not scream or rage through the palace halls for all to witness. Instead, her anger carried a surgical precision. Each word she delivered was measured, deliberate, like a dagger pressed carefully against vulnerable flesh. She reminded Alexander of the sacrifices she had made, the years she had endured whispers and mockery, the scorn of a court that had once despised her very presence. She had swallowed countless humiliations to legitimize their love, to give him the life he had long craved. And now, after everything, he had undone it all with a single confession that Isabella still ruled his heart. Alexander listened, his face marked by profound regret, but he did not recant his words. He could not. For as desperately as he wished to comfort his wife, he knew that to deny his feelings for Isabella would be a deception too profound to sustain. He stood at the window in silence as Eleanor's voice rose and fell, her anger punctuated by long stretches where the weight of unspoken history hung between them like a shroud. By the time her fury finally ebbed, the space between them had transformed into something colder than anger, a chasm of wounded pride and broken trust. In the days that followed, Eleanor wielded her silence as a weapon of exquisite cruelty. She withdrew from him in private, offering only the most essential words, her presence arctic where it had once been welcoming. To the courtiers, the shift was unmistakable. They spoke in hushed tones of the queen's hardened bearing, of the frost. That seemed to settle in any room the king entered. The public witnessed none of this internal storm. On the royal balcony at state ceremonies, they stood united, smiling for the gathered crowds. But those who observed carefully could sense the underlying tension. Eleanor's smile carried a razor's edge, her gaze remained distant, while Alexander's expression bore the weight of a man who knew he had released a truth that would shadow their marriage for years to come. The crown they shared had become heavier than gold, weighted now with secrets that could never be taken back. Charles's guilt and regret. In the wake of Queen Eleanor's fury, King Alexander retreated into himself, a familiar refuge for a man who had spent his life burdened by expectation and haunted by choices that never seemed entirely his own. He carried his guilt quietly, with the heavy dignity that comes from years of training in royal composure. Yet those closest to him could see it in the way his gaze lingered too long on old portraits, in the hesitation of his speech, in the faint tremor of his hands when he affixed his seal to royal decrees. For Alexander, the words he had spoken to Eleanor were not simply a careless admission. They were the raw truth of a heart that had never been granted the freedom to love without consequence. Isabella's memory was the foundation of that truth. No matter how stormy their union had been, no matter the fierce arguments and painful betrayals, Isabella had been woven into his very essence. She had given him his heirs, princes who carried her grace in their bearing and her warmth in their smiles. Even in death, she remained present, embedded in the fabric of his existence in ways that Eleanor could never erase. To confess that he had never ceased loving her was not an act of treachery, but an acknowledgement of the reality he confronted daily. Yet Alexander understood how those words had pierced his wife, how deeply they had torn into the delicate harmony they had constructed over the years. He spent long evenings in solitude, gazing into the flames, the burden of his guilt settling upon him like a lead cloak. He regretted not only the anguish he had inflicted upon Eleanor, but the truth he had harbored for so long. For decades, he had attempted to navigate the impossible equilibrium between obligation and longing, between the demands of the crown and the yearnings of the heart. He had endured mockery, watched the kingdom stumble under the weight of scandal, and lost the woman who had once embodied the realm's devotion. That loss was not something that could be erased, not even by the steadiness Eleanor provided him, and so the guilt persisted, not merely for what he had spoken, but for everything that had brought them to this moment. At times, he would rise before dawn and walk the palace galleries alone, his footsteps reverberating against the ancient stone. The silence seemed to taunt him, reminding him that sovereignty could bestow power, wealth, and reverence, but not the tranquility he desperately sought. In his private writings, he penned verses of remorse, meditations on roads not traveled, and questions about whether the decisions of his youth had cursed his present. To the world, he was the sovereign, head of state, guardian of ancient traditions. To himself, he remained the man who had failed to reconcile love with duty and who continued to carry Isabella's spirit within his heart. This contradiction tormented him daily. He loved Eleanor with a devotion forged through years of shared struggles, yet he could not escape the knowledge that he had drawn her into a life forever shadowed by another woman's memory. His regret extended beyond himself to her, for the reality that she would never be free of comparisons, and that his honesty had rekindled the very doubts she had fought to overcome. In the stillness of his chambers, Alexander often questioned whether wearing the crown justified the personal sacrifices it demanded. For what value does sovereignty hold if it costs a man his peace? And what meaning has love if it remains forever bound to ghosts that refuse to rest? The palace. In crisis mode. The aftermath of King Alexander's confession did not remain contained within the royal quarters for long. In the palace, discretion had always been its greatest shield, yet discretion is delicate, and secrets have a way of seeping into hallways where too many ears are waiting. Within days, whispers had begun to drift among the servants, hushed exchanges over hurried meals, fragments of overheard conversations woven together into something perilous. The revelation that Alexander had confessed his enduring love for the late Isabella became more than a private wound between husband and wife. It became a threat to the crown itself. Royal advisors moved swiftly. The inner council, long practiced in extinguishing embers before they became infernos, convened urgent sessions to determine how best to contain the crisis. The challenge was not merely the truth of Alexander's words, but the danger of public perception. If the press discovered that the king had admitted he never ceased loving Isabella, the story would explode into a maelstrom that could destroy everything Eleanor had struggled to achieve. It would not be presented as a man's private reflection, but as evidence of divided loyalty, a headline destined for scandal sheets hungry for royal blood. Behind carved mahogany doors, advisors debated their response. Should they orchestrate carefully choreographed appearances of the king and queen together, projecting unity and strength? Should they plant strategic stories of Eleanor's resilience, Alexander's devotion, and the solidity of their union? Some argued that denial would only fuel speculation, while others maintained that silence remained their strongest weapon. Every option carried peril, and every counselor understood that the smallest error could unravel years of meticulous management. Meanwhile, the atmosphere within the palace grew electric with tension. Staff moved through their duties with heightened caution, aware of the friction between Alexander and Eleanor, but careful never to acknowledge it. Even seasoned courtiers, veterans of previous crises, confessed privately that the stakes felt unprecedented. This was not merely another rumor from the scandal mills. It was a confession from the king himself, one that struck at the core of his marriage and threatened to resurrect wounds the monarchy had spent decades attempting to heal. Alexander himself seemed detached from the tempest his words had created. He fulfilled his official obligations with quiet determination, his expression grave, his movements measured. Eleanor, conversely, carried her rage beneath a veneer of perfect composure. In public, she smiled graciously and acknowledged the crowds, but advisors could sense the inferno still burning beneath her serene facade. Her private glances were razor-sharp, her silence glacial, and her presence demanded a wariness that left staff monitoring every word spoken in her vicinity. The palace, for all its magnificence, had transformed into a pressure vessel. Advisors understood that a single leak could shatter everything, and already they could sense the press circling like predators. Journalists who had devoted careers to pursuing royal secrets were making careful inquiries, hunting for the story that would define their legacy. The question was not whether the truth would surface, but how much would escape, and whether the monarchy could survive the storm once it broke. Within the marble corridors, the apparatus of crisis management churned relentlessly. But even as advisors labored to smother the flames, the acrid smell of smoke had already begun to drift beyond the palace walls. The silence that had long protected them was beginning to crack, and through those fissures, the truth pressed closer to the light. The nation's heart remembers. When the whispers finally escaped beyond the palace walls, they spread like wildfire through dry grass, igniting quickly in the combustible realm of public fascination. At first, it appeared as mere speculation buried in society columns, an anonymous source hinting at discord within the royal household. But soon the story crystallized, and headlines across the kingdom blazed with news of King Alexander's alleged confession. The words, "I never stopped loving Isabella," became a chorus echoed in broadsheets, public debates, and digital forums, sparking the very frenzy the palace had desperately sought to prevent. For the people, the revelation struck a nerve that was both raw and achingly familiar. Isabella had always belonged to them as much as she had belonged to the crown. Her compassion, her authenticity, and her untimely death had secured her place in the nation's soul in a way that no controversy could ever diminish. To learn that Alexander had confessed his enduring love for her seemed to confirm what many had believed all along, that despite the turbulence of their union, she had been the one woman he could never truly release from his heart. Crowds once, again gathered at monuments, her portrait gracing front pages as though she still walked among them. Memorial gardens overflowed with fresh bouquets, and candlelight vigils spontaneously appeared in town squares across the realm. The people's devotion to Isabella's memory burned as brightly as ever, perhaps even more intensely for having been validated by the king's own words. Queen Eleanor, despite her years of patient work to reshape public opinion, became the target of renewed criticism. Commentators revisited the painful history, replaying Isabella's own documented struggles, once again casting Eleanor as the shadow figure who had disrupted a fairy tale. Social networks surged with declarations of loyalty to Isabella, many presenting the revelation as evidence that she had always been the true Queen of Hearts, regardless of who wore the actual crown. For every measured voice defending Eleanor's rightful place beside Alexander, countless others insisted she could never rival Isabella's eternal grip on the kingdom's affections. The comparison was merciless and, perhaps, inevitable. Within the palace, advisors observed the tempest with weary acceptance. The story they had fought to suppress had metamorphosed into something beyond their control, feeding on the very emotions the monarchy most dreaded. Alexander's private anguish had become a public theater, and Eleanor's carefully constructed legitimacy was once again under siege from a woman who no longer breathed, but still commanded absolute devotion. The upheaval transcended mere scandal. It touched the deepest chords of love, loss, and the unbreakable connection between Isabella and the people who had cherished her. As the kingdom debated Alexander's confession, one truth emerged with crystalline clarity. Isabella's influence over the crown had not diminished with the passage of time. If anything, it had grown more powerful, transformed by tragedy into something approaching the divine, a love story that death could not end, a queen whose reign would never truly conclude. The future of their love and the monarchy. As the tempest of public reaction raged beyond the palace walls, the atmosphere within grew thick with unspoken dread. King Alexander and Queen Eleanor continued their public appearances, their hands intertwined during state ceremonies, their faces arranged in the carefully practiced expressions of royalty. Yet those who observed closely could sense the chasm between them. Eleanor's gaze, once warm and reassuring, had crystallized into something more distant, more protective. Alexander's bearing, typically marked by contemplative gravity, now seemed weighted with remorse, as if each wave of public devotion to Isabella drove the wedge between husband and wife ever deeper. Behind ornate doors, the palace possessed no clear solution to the question that now loomed. Could this union endure beneath the burden of phantoms? Eleanor, though seething, was not without wisdom. She grasped the imperative of maintaining unity for the sake of the crown. Her entire existence alongside Alexander had been an education in perseverance, in surviving tempests of scandal and fighting toward acceptance. But even her fortitude had boundaries, and the confession had struck at a truth she could no longer deny. She was his wife, but she would never be his singular love. The crown rested upon her brow, yet Isabella's shadow still stretched above it, untouchable and everlasting. For Alexander, the turmoil proved even more labyrinthine. His anguish over Isabella's life and death had never diminished, and the truth he had spoken was not something he could unsay. He cherished Eleanor profoundly, but in a different manner, a love built through companionship, devotion, and the intimacy of shared years. Isabella's love had been something else entirely, tempestuous, tender, tragic. To acknowledge that he had never ceased loving her was not to diminish Eleanor, but to admit that Isabella's place in his heart remained immutable. Yet Alexander was also sovereign, and he understood that every personal failure now reflected upon the monarchy itself. What had once been private grief was now a public narrative, one that rekindled divisions the crown could scarcely afford. The people's response only widened the fracture. Across the kingdom and beyond, Isabella's name was spoken with reverence, her memory celebrated as though she had never departed. Alexander became a figure of sympathy for some, a mourning man still haunted by the past. But for many others, his confession was evidence that the monarchy itself was an antiquated institution, clinging to old wounds, unable to progress. Eleanor once again bore the heaviest criticism, her legitimacy questioned anew. Every smile she offered in public seemed to invite examination, every gesture analyzed for traces of bitterness. Ultimately, the question transcended the mere survival of a marriage. It concerned the resilience of the monarchy itself. Could a crown so steeped in tradition withstand the weight of Isabella's spirit? Could Alexander and Eleanor present themselves as a unified force when the fractures between them were so apparent to those who looked carefully? The palace would continue to project strength, for that was what the institution demanded. But within the hearts of the king and queen, the truth lingered like a wound that refused to mend. Alexander's words had unleashed more than marital discord. They had reignited the eternal triangle that defined his existence, one between duty, present love, and the memory of the woman the world would never permit him to forget. As the monarchy advanced into an uncertain future, one truth became inescapable. Isabella's shadow would always walk beside them, a reminder that some legacies transcend time and death. They endure, shaping the destiny of those left behind. And so, the confession that Alexander never ceased loving Isabella has left the monarchy standing upon fractured foundations. Behind the polished smiles and royal ceremonies lies a marriage tested by specters that refuse to fade. Eleanor may wear the crown, but Isabella still reigns in the hearts of millions, and perhaps in Alexander's heart as well. The question now extends beyond whether their love can survive. It is whether the monarchy itself can endure such shadows. One truth remains absolute. Isabella's legacy is eternal, and it continues to shape the future of the crown.